a lot of times when you become a leader, especially a Christian leader, you can become a professional Christian leader. And that's deadly to our soul. And it begins with maintaining a sense of awe in the presence of God.
Well, hi, everyone. Welcome to Framework Leadership, a podcast about principles and ideas you can use today to take your leadership to the next level. I'm your host, Kent Ingle, president of Southeastern University.
And I'm your co-host, Michael Steiner, vice president for innovation.
And man, we're excited today to talk with Greg Surratt. Greg is author, leader, founding pastor of Seacoast Church. He's also the president, co-founder of the Association of Related Churches, which is a global church planning initiative that has established, over 800 churches worldwide?
About 1,100
About
now.
1,100
Yeah.
now. Wow.
Yeah.
And great to have you with us. Thanks for taking time.
Great to be here. Love what you guys are doing.
Appreciate that. Now, as we get this conversation going, you've impacted and made a profound impact on the global Christian community over the years, especially through, your leadership and your ministry at Seacoast and all that you developed there. Tell us how all that started and what inspired you to really launch Seacoast. And
Sure. Yeah, I didn't have a real strong start in ministry. I got fired my first 3 jobs as a youth pastor, and figured out that wasn't probably God's best for me. But at the last one, my wife, we're from Denver, Colorado, and she bought a book in a bookstore that was in the bargain bin, Yeah. I mean, the full retail price was $2.50 on it. And she got it for 25 cents, and it was called All Originality Makes a Dull Church. And the premise of it was that you didn't have to reinvent the wheel, that God was doing a lot of things in a lot of places. Look around. And it was a story of several, churches during that particular time period. That must have been the 70s maybe. And I'd never been outside of our, local denominational church. And something about that inspired me to say, you know what, I want to do this differently. And I had a desire to reach people who didn't normally go to church. And I know that's typical today, but back then it wasn't.
Right.
And there was a 10-year gap from when I read the book until we started Seacoast Church. But a lot of that was a stimulus. I felt it wouldn't go away. God really, in my heart, was, and I wanted to reach people who were friends of mine, who were like me, who maybe just weren't going to church. Yeah. And so that was the stimulus of doing it.
Do you remember what are one or two of the insights that you had when you read that book that kept with you all those years and all that kind of stuff that kind of spurred you in there?
Well, there were a lot of things. I mean, it was the story of Robert Schuller and what became Crystal Cathedral, but it was another name at that point. Chuck Smith, I think, Calvary Chapel, Gene Getz Bible Church. They're just, what I would do is I'd read this and I'd save up my money and I'd buy whatever book these guys bought. And from Schuller, it was the idea of possibility, that nothing was impossible. In fact, even today, I love to sit down. I did it this week on a particular issue and said, if nothing was impossible and money wasn't an issue and God's will was being done perfectly on earth in this situation as it's being done in heaven, what would we try? What would we attempt? Wow. What would we go for? And that's been a continuous learning over the years. Didn't agree with everything everybody said or all the theology. Who cares? I mean, we're going to get to heaven someday, and God's going to say, well, they were right about this, but not this, and all. I don't care. Right. Learn from everybody. Yeah. And just practical teaching, relationship stuff that you could, really build strong relationships in ministry, and felt kind of isolated, and just a lot of stuff.
That's a powerful question, though. I mean, think about what would you do? And I was reading, there's a book I was reading this week, Vivid Vision by Cameron Herold, and he was talking about how too many people, they make their vision statements or their next, but when you really look at it, all it is just more of what they have right now. And too many people don't take that leap into thinking, okay, what's that dangerous question? From your experience in working with ARC and different pastors, what has that question done? What happens when people start really taking that question seriously?
Oh, it takes the lid off things. It's Because normally when we dream, vision, the things that leaders do, we do it within the context and framework of what we have.
Right, right.
And that's good. I mean, we've got to be real about that stuff. But I love to begin at a place of, what if nothing was impossible?
Yeah.
I think the Bible talks about that a little bit.
Right.
And then Jesus teaches us to pray that his will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Well, my piece of earth is, whatever it is that I'm involved in. And I remember Seacoast, we started in 1988. The first 5 years, we had less people every year than we had the year before. And that was one of the metrics of what does it mean to, to build a church or whatever. And that metric was not up and to the right. It was down and to the left and constantly. And in 5 years after we started, 1993, I went to the beach. And I hate the beach. I live on a beach. It's awesome. But I live on a beach, theoretically. I don't live on the beach, but I live in a town that's by the beach. And I would love beaches if they didn't have sand. I don't like sand.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
But there's something awe-inspiring about looking at this vast expanse and realizing how small you are and how big God is. And that's the first time I did that. I sat there, I took my Bible and notebook, and I asked God, I said, if your will was being done in Mount Pleasant, which is where we lived, and it was being done like it is on earth or in heaven, what would that look like? And it expanded my mind to believe God for big things.
Yeah. Now, you are like the father of multi-site and building and developing that. And then, of course, you were co-founder of launching ARC. But kind of give us the vision behind multi-site and how that came about.
Yeah, I'd like to call it a vision. It's a nightmare.
Right.
We had started to grow. We were I've always been a part of very small churches. I grew up in a small Assembly of God church, pastored a smaller Assembly of God church, and so I love small churches. I love small pastors. In fact, in the whole I'll skip ahead during the multi-site thing. A national reporter of one of the big newspapers was writing a piece on mega church multi-site and all that. And he asked if he could talk to me. I said, sure. And I didn't realize it was not a friendly piece. And so he was going down a road about all that. I said, time out. I said, I'm a small church guy. I love small churches. I said, this one just got away from us. You know?
Right.
I didn't know what to do with that.
It's not my fault. I wasn't trying.
Exactly. And so the church began to grow, and we did multiple services, and then 3 services, and then 4 services, and 5 services. And at that point, I hated my life. And you're not created to do that. And so we're going to build a bigger building. We're in the South. Bible Belt, but Charleston isn't. It's kind of unique because it's a cosmopolitan city, and so it's kind of a donut in the Bible Belt. But I didn't see that coming, and our town council said not in our backyard, and chose to make a stand politically in a bigger issue that they were doing in our city on us, and it was devastating. I mean, it took me by surprise. We had purchased, a lot of land right around us and rezoned it where we couldn't use it for anything. And I remember going to my office after the decision came down. And I did what I do when I'm discouraged. And by the way, if you're going to be a leader, especially a pastor, the occupational hazard, one of them is discouragement. You're going to get discouraged. You just got to figure out what to do with it. I got discouraged. I went to my office and I closed the windows down, turned the lights off, and turned on some country music because they always lose something.
Right.
Lose a girlfriend, a truck, a dog.
Yeah.
And so I'm in that moment, and honestly, in that moment, there was a theological truth that was in my head that dropped into my heart, and it was this is that God is omniscient. Okay, it's real hard to surprise an omniscient God. He's never had a moment where he went, oh, my bad, I didn't see that coming. And if that's the truth, then God isn't surprised by our circumstances, and He is at work on a solution before we even knew there was a problem. And so we began to work on a solution. And so I like to say that creativity or innovation is just desperation in a prettier package. And we get desperate, and we have to do something. And so we began to think about what we could do and talk to a few churches, and a group called Leadership Network convened, half a dozen to a dozen churches. A lot of them you know now, you didn't know then. Life Church, Oklahoma City, us, Community Christian in Chicago. There were several of them. And we began to try to figure out, okay, here are the rules. The rules are you can do ministry at this address on this particular piece of land. Now, the city has told us we can't do any more ministry there. Does that mean that's the end of it? And so we began to think outside the box. What is possible? If nothing were impossible, what would we do? And so we began to meet together with these other churches about once every 6 months for a week and strategize and think about it and experiment. It's all a big experiment. And I remember one time early on I won't give all the details on it, but we had planted a church that wasn't doing well. Pastor wanted to quit, and we had done one multi-site, not very far from where we were, and this was a 90-minute drive from our church, and we're in a vehicle going up, and I remember Byron Davis, who had retired recently as a Fisher-Price Toys CEO, and he was helping me think about these things, and he was in our church, and we're going to a meeting that turned out to be a brutal. It wasn't a good meeting. We're going to tell the congregation why we were going to try to do this thing that nobody heard of before, multi-site there. And he told me, he said, "Don't get discouraged." He said, "If it doesn't work here, doesn't mean it won't work somewhere else.
Right.
But if it does work here, it can work anywhere." And that became prophetic.
Can you take us to the conversation when multi-site first was brought up? I mean, obviously this is a long journey. You're going through all these different processes, but what was that moment like where they're like, "Hey, here's this crazy idea"? Like, what did that look like? What did the conversation look like? What was your impression? Who did it come from?
Well, what we did was when we got the no, we were like, we got to do something. And I remembered I had gone to a conference somewhere where Larry Osborne, who it was in San Diego, and he was doing a breakout. You do breakouts? And he was doing a breakout on video venue, I think he called it. There were 6 people in the room. Nobody was interested in it at all. And I popped into the room, listened to it a little bit, and thought, that's interesting. Really didn't stick. And then I had heard that Willow Creek was experimenting with an offsite, they called it, in Wheaton, I think it was. And I had heard that there was a church in Rockford, Illinois, that was watching old Willow Creek videos. And they didn't really have a teaching pastor. I think it was called Heartland. And so we're desperate. And so Byron Davis, the guy I talked about earlier, he and I got just got on an airplane. And we went on a Saturday night to San Diego. And we saw what Larry Osborne was doing, there. And we thought, that's interesting. And we took the overnight, the red eye, to Chicago, took a car out to Rockford, changed clothes in their bathroom, and watched what they did. And it was an old John Ortberg tape from 3 years ago on a Wednesday night in Willow Creek. Wow. And yet I always ask myself when I go to a church, would I go here? And they had small groups. They had just worship. It was I thought, I probably would go to church here. Yeah. And then we went into Willow Creek, and they weren't doing a good job of their first offsite. It wasn't, they fixed it. They got it right, but it wasn't right at the time. And we went to a Dave & Buster's, I think, to eat. And Byron and I sat down, and he said, "What do you think?" And I said, "I think there's something to this. I think we could figure this out." And And so we went home, and I told my brother Jeff, who he was on staff at the time, and I explained the idea. I said, here's what I think we could do, is we could rent a building, and we'll have live worship, and we'll pipe the message in, is what we'll do. And he said, are you kidding me? He said, that's about the dumbest idea I had ever heard. He said, and it was. Well, but I'll just say this on that. He went ahead and ultimately wrote the book, The Multi-Site Revolution, which became the Bible of all the multi-site stuff. And he gets all the credit, you know.
Yeah.
But he thought it was terrible. But here's what I never heard.
Right.
People always go, how did you talk people into, especially, how did you get everybody on board in the church? And I said, well, that never happened.
Right.
And what I never heard early on was, that's a really good idea.
Wow.
Never heard that.
Wow.
Never heard that.
The whole way through.
Oh yeah, well, early on, no.
Right.
I mean, because it was a new idea. It wasn't everybody wasn't doing it, and it didn't sound like something that would work.
Right, right. It was also. I would just love this idea that just because it's a good idea doesn't mean that other people are going to validate it. And I think too many leaders get caught up in that with their ideas. They've got visions, they got dreams, but they look for that validation when there's only really one validation that you need, which is the Holy Spirit talking inside your.
Well, I read years later. I read a blog by Mark Cuban, and I think it was titled "Never Listen to the Customer." And I thought, well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And what he did, he was just talking about when you're creating something new. He said leaders create the future.
Right.
And if you poll the audience on something new, usually they're not on board. You know, he talks about the fact that if Henry Ford would have polled the audience, they would have want faster horses.
Yep.
Steve Jobs, I've got an iPad right here. And actually, I preached the day the first iPad came out on an iPad. That's how weird and techie I am. But nobody thought this was a good idea. Why do you need a big phone?
Right. Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And yet, oftentimes leaders have to kind of create the future and see the future.
Yeah.
I'm going to derail the conversation here. I'm so sorry. But if we're talking about the future and we're talking about tech, you were one of the first to preach off an iPad. In a few minutes, AI, what's it going to do to the church?
AI is great.
Yeah.
I hope it doesn't destroy the world.
Right.
But
as long as it doesn't become Skynet, right? Like, put that aside.
I use it all the time.
Really?
Yeah. I think if you use AI to create your sermon, you know, and you're going to preach it's just awful.
Right. It was terrible.
But if you have an idea, and what would be a way to, you can ask all kinds of questions.
Right.
All kinds of research. And so I love it.
Yeah, I think it's going to be fascinating to utilize in leadership. I love your book, Your Reverend, and you talk a lot about, you know, kind of challenging the traditional ways of doing church. What are a couple of examples that you've found that were pretty impactful when it comes to thinking differently, besides just the multi-site and all of that, but I mean, just other ways that you look at how we do church?
Yeah, you know, one of the, and there are just a lot. In fact, you are, you know, you had this great university and have this leadership impact. And I like to tell young folks that I hope some of you challenge what we're doing.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of talk about deconstruction.
Right.
I'm not afraid of it, just as long as you reconstruct. You know, I mean, we've all deconstructed some things.
Right.
But I hope that next generation, I believe that. It is time right now for several somebodies to challenge how we do church. I really believe it is. And that's kind of probably some of what we've tried to do. Sometimes it's just desperation and you go, let's try this. One of the things, style of worship, several years ago, I felt very dry, like, boy, we could do this in our sleep kind of a thing. You know, you have certain liturgy that we do, and some churches do liturgy for thousands of years, which is good, but ours is kind of, you go into one megachurch or another megachurch and they look just alike. And I was dry inside, and I asked the Lord, I said, how can we experience more of your presence and your power? And I went on a journey of, I didn't know it was a journey, but it was. Next 6 months of, I did a thing for John Maxwell in Scotland, and I substitute for somebody who couldn't be there. And while I was there, somebody said, "Do you want to take an adventure?" And I said, "Yeah, if it doesn't involve skirts and painting your face, I'm in." Yeah. And we went to the Isle of Iona, which is where Christianity came from Ireland to Scotland and then to the rest of Europe. And there's this monastery there, and it was a horrible day, so nobody was around. And in that monastery, I saw, a little wooden cross that people put prayer requests or something on, and I experienced the presence of God. I went and visited a friend of mine who had a large charismatic church in Louisiana, and they would call people forward and anoint them with oil and pray, and I experienced the presence and power of God. I went to a friend of mine's Anglican church and went and took communion, and I'm not going to argue for transubstantiation or consubstantiation or any of that. All I know is I experienced the presence and power of God in that. I went to on another Maxwell trip. I was going to India, and I'd never been to Paris. And I thought, you got to make one stop on the way. I'm going to Paris. So I stopped in Paris, and I went to the Notre Dame Cathedral, which, a lot of people would say the presence of God has departed a long time ago. And there was a place where they were lighting candles. And so I went over there. I'd never been around that. And I sensed the presence and power of God. I don't know if those candles are what burned down the cathedral a few years later or what. But in all of that, and I was reading Isaiah where it says that in your heads or in your lips worship me, but your hearts are far from me. And so I announced a few weeks later at Seacoast, everything's going to change. And we never announce change because 65% of the people are predisposed not to want to change. Right. So we just tweak stuff and we just do it.
Right.
But I said, we're going to change. So we had a huge crowd, kind of NASCAR car wreck, maybe what's going to go on here. And I told them we're going to change the way that we worship. And we have for like 15 years or 20 years, where we have two songs on the front end, a greeting by a pastor, preaching within 12 minutes of the beginning of the service, which, by the way, if people come in late to your church, if you'll put the preaching up front, they won't come in late.
Right.
And then we have worship as a response to the preaching. And in the worship, there's anointing oil and prayer. There's candles for intercessory prayer. There's pinning confessions of sin on a cross. There's communion every week. There's giving of offerings, and it has totally revitalized how we do church and kept it fresh for 15 or 20 years. Wow. But it's not something you see everywhere.
Right.
And so that's a long answer to a very short.
And so what advice would you get? I feel like there's probably a lot of listeners right now, pastors, different leaders that are in a similar spot which you outlined, right? Where it's, there's two places of desperation. There's at the bottom and at the top. And maybe they're at the top. Maybe they're feeling like, I've been doing this. Everything's easy. I'm bored. I'm feeling it, but I don't know what to do. What advice would you give them in that first step?
Yeah, it starts with and we all give this advice, but putting God first in everything that we do. A lot of times when you become a leader, especially a Christian leader, you can become a professional Christian leader. Yeah. And that's deadly to our soul. And it begins with maintaining a sense of awe in the presence of God. Awe that God would use me. And when we, rather than, and that's about gratitude, really. And when gratitude leaves, entitlement comes in. And that doesn't live well. And when I have a sense of that in my spirit, I really need to examine and go back to the roots of, I have a Father who desperately loves me, and God, keep me in awe of that. And that's a beginning for me. Is just go back to the what was it that I felt? What did I experience? Yeah. Why am I doing what I'm doing right now?
Yeah. Wow. That's powerful. I know something that's you're pretty passionate about, and really it's a common challenge right now in ministry across the board, and that's burnout.
Yeah.
And trying to avoid burnout. You actually just co-wrote a book, The Endurance Factor.
Yeah.
That discusses kind of the topic and provides a lot of insight and wisdom for those who are looking for, some practical advice to help them finish the race, strong.
Yeah.
What encouragement would you give to leaders, to families who have families, responsibilities, and they're just overwhelmed and struggling to do it all?
Yeah. Yeah, you've got to, Chip Judd, who's my counselor, he and I wrote a book together, The Endurance Factor, How Ministry Leaders Can Avoid Burnout, Live Well, and Finish Strong. And I really believe that Jesus said, I've come that you might have life.
Yeah.
And that's living well and finishing strong. And I think one of the things is just to be aware of the whole burnout thing. Burnout tends to be, there's a lot of definitions, but at its core, it's just a bone weariness. It is cynicism.
Yeah.
When you feel yourself being cynical on a lot of things, it's feeling like what I do doesn't really matter, make a difference. You can hear all of that in the prophet Elijah. We won't go through all of that, but that's the classical case of it. And what kinds of things can you do when you feel that way? I think you need to have rhythms of rest in your life. That's one of the things, where you have a daily rest with God. There's a lot to that, but that's the life for me. There's a weekly rest, or you taking a day off.
Yeah.
You'd be surprised. We started a retreat center, and we've had 1,500 pastors and leaders that have come through in the last 2.5 years, and more than half don't take a day off. That's a recipe for burnout.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's hard, especially startups.
Yeah.
You have startup business people, young guys, girls coming out of college, and what do you do? And startups are hard, and there are seasons like that, but God had the biggest startup in the world.
Yeah.
He did it in 6 days. Why? Because it wanted to be the long haul. It's not a sprint. We used to say, it's a marathon, not a sprint. Now I say it's a marathon relay.
Yeah.
You want to hand it out. You don't want to drop the
That's
baton. You want to hand it off to somebody. And so there's a weekly rest. There's a quarterly rest. If you're married, you need a weekend away with your spouse. You got to get it on your calendar. There's a yearly rest, and I know a lot about that. There's a sabbatical rest, and those are all important. But I also think that we've got to have around us a band of brothers or sisters that I like to say you need to sit at least one table regularly with a group of people who love you but are not impressed with you.
I like that.
And that can give you accurate feedback, that can, care about you. And you can't trust everybody to do that, but you need it. And there are a lot of things, and we talk about it in the book, but that's just a couple of things.
That's good.
Yeah.
It's so good. And you've talked a lot about, and you write a lot about, you married your childhood sweetheart.
I did.
Yeah. Now you've got great family, 4 kids, 14 grandkids. Tell us about how your marriage has played a role. How did that strength, tell us how it's interacted as you've learned about how to deal with this challenge in ministry.
Yeah, I think I just lucked out.
Yeah.
I'd like to say I was looking for just the right, and I wasn't. Oh, man. Somebody said that when you fall in love, about 70% of your IQ just shuts down, So there's been the grace of God. It's so funny. Debbie and I, in every personality test, and I love all the personality tests. I just love them all. And in every one of them, we are exact opposites. Wow. Like, take a DISC test, for instance. I'm a high D, high I, absolutely no S or C. I've never finished anything in my life, okay? I love the Working Genius, Patrick Lencioni.
Yeah.
I love that book, and it set me free because he said that tenacious, that finishing thing. He said, you just weren't created to finish things, and I'm not. You got to get people around you that do.
Right.
But so I'm a high D, high I, nothing else. She has no D, no I, all S and C. That early on, in every test, I could go through every test. It's the exact same way. And early on, I tried to fix her because she wasn't right. She was wrong. She was not the right way. And so that made for intense fellowship, and that was hard. Kind of got through that and figured out that, wow, the two of us together that's incredible. Yeah. In fact, I would say Seacoast would not exist as it is without that. And she's not an upfront person by any means. But so recognizing that, and then we had a real rough patch. I mean, we've been married 47 years. The first year or two were not real good. There were several really good years, and then there were about 3 in the middle that were just not good at all. And here's where it was. I remember 1999. Easter services are over. We'd had 6 or 7, I don't know. I pulled into the driveway of our house, and I looked over at her, and I said, do you realize that we had over 2,000 people in church this week for the very first time? And she looks at me, and she says, that's your dream. It's certainly not mine. Wow. And I thought, Houston, we have a problem. And I seriously, I had no idea.
Wow.
I had no idea. And it took 2 years, 2 or 3 years to dig out of that, to realize that I had a girlfriend, and it was the church.
Oh, my gosh.
And she was not cherished. I didn't even know what it meant for her to, it took me so long to figure out, how does that work? What does that mean? And words are just words, Yeah. And so it was a brutal, but it was a wonderful time of putting things in perspective, that the church can never take precedent. The job can never take precedent. Because, you know what, I'm not the pastor of that church anymore. I'm the founding pastor, but I'm still her husband.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I will be forever, and God willing. And so that was, I don't even know what the question was, but
I love it.
That's been a part of the process.
Yeah. So good. Well, we're going to close our conversation. We do this with everyone, a quick fire round. We ask 3 quick questions with 3 quick answers. What comes to the top of your head? And we have 3, so we'll start with you, Michael. Fire one away.
Got it. So what's the first piece of advice you give to aspiring pastors?
Don't sweat the small stuff, and everything is small stuff. Your message isn't as important as you think it is.
And what would you say to someone, I'm trying to discover my calling? What do they need to do?
Yeah, your calling, I think, is as simple as being an accurate picture of who Jesus is and bringing the kingdom rule of God into every situation you're in, and you can do that in any zip code.
Wow, that's so good.
So last question, how do you not sweat the small stuff without going crazy? Like, I mean, you could get so crazy looking at all the different details, trying not to sweat all the small stuff. How do you do that without going crazy?
I don't know. I haven't figured that out yet.
Okay. I love it. Love it. You still go crazy. You just go crazy. That's the solution right there.
That's so good, man. This has been a great conversation. Always love to hear you and sit down. I mean, your wisdom it's just incredible. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
This conversation. And for those of you who are watching, you go, is he wearing a tie?
That's
not really normal, is it?
Because
we're taping this on a commencement night where Greg is our commencement speaker, and he's about ready to go out and share all of his incredible wisdom with our amazing students. So just wanted to let you know. He didn't dress up for this podcast. It was for something else. Anyway, we're grateful for everyone joining in on us, and stay tuned to what's next for Framework Leadership Podcast. Take care, everybody.
Thank you so much for joining us today on Framework Leadership. If you're watching on YouTube right now would be a great time to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button so you can get more leadership content right into your YouTube feed. You can also check us out on Instagram at Kent_Ingle, at Dr. Michael Steiner, or on Twitter and YouTube at Kent Ingle. And hey, if you love great email newsletters, and I know that I do. You want to check out the Framework Leadership newsletter. Every single Friday drops in great tips to be a better leader, resources, thoughts right into your inbox. Check it out. You can sign up at kentingle.com. Make sure you hop onto there. Thank you so much for listening to Framework Leadership.
Take care, everybody.